the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead.
Right.
So the Bible clearly teaches that. Now, a person can say, well, I think the Bible's wrong, and that's their right. That's perfectly fine that they have the right to say that. But the Bible teaches that
Right.
Jesus Christ rose from the dead.
Hi, welcome to From the Ground Up, where we are helping you build your faith one step at a time. And I am here with my colleague and biblical scholar, New Testament scholar, Dr. Andy McClurg. And today we're going to talk about interpretation, biblical interpretation. But before that, I want him to just introduce himself a little bit for those who maybe missed the previous episode.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Yes, I'm Andy McClurg, and I am a professor here at Grand Canyon University, technically an instructor, but that's okay. And my area of study has been the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and then in Greek, and then in Hebrew. So I've studied the languages, and I've studied the Greek Old Testament, and in the process, I've studied the Greek New Testament because that's kind of important.
Yeah.
So, so that's my background, and I teach Greek, and I teach Hebrew, and I teach a few other classes, interpretation, and other classes that we offer here at GCU.
Awesome. So you're more of the Greek scholar overall.
Yes, Greek and Hebrew,
Greek
yes,
and Hebrew.
and then how the Greek translates the Hebrew, and then in the New Testament, of course, just looking at the New Testament documents, how they're transmitted. I've also studied text criticism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So thinking of textual criticism, thinking of biblical translation. We talked about translation last time. Let's look into interpretation. This is a question that I get quite often. What about biblical interpretations? Can't you just interpret the Bible however you want? Don't we can all find our own interpretations, and your interpretation is different than mine, but that's okay. Can you speak to that? Help us to understand what it means to interpret the Bible and how we can do that.
Yes, well, that's an important question because we do hear statements like that. All interpretations are the same. You interpret it your way, I interpret it my way. None is right. Now, sometimes when we talk about interpretation, we're talking about application.
Mm.
And so once we find out what the Bible means, then we apply it in different ways. But oftentimes when we talk about this question, we're talking about the Bible can mean anything that we want it to mean. Now, let's try that logic with anything else. It doesn't really work very well. So let's say that I'm driving down the road and I see a sign that says, road closed, bridge under repair. And what if I were to interpret that to say, well, that means that the bridge is fine, I can drive over it. Well, that's fine, you can interpret it that way, but that's not what the sign means.
Right.
The sign means that the bridge is out, and if you drive over it, you're probably going to get in trouble.
Okay.
And so we understand just in everyday language and messages and communication that there is a clear meaning to what we're trying to say or to communicate. Imagine that you are pulled over by a policeman, you're going 85 miles an hour in a 55 zone, and you come to court and you stand before the judge and you say, well, Your Honor, I thought that 55 meant 85. That's how I interpret it. Well, everybody in the courtroom would laugh,
Yeah.
and the judge would say, no, you and I both know that means 55, and you're going to pay the fine for speeding.
Yeah.
So in any area of life, we understand that the message has a particular intended meaning, and we get the intended meaning based on the words that are there. So let me give you a biblical example. So in Mark 6:39, it says that this is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and he gets them together, and then Mark 6:39 says he had them sit down in groups of 50 on the green grass. All right, so reading that, it's pretty clear. Virtually everybody who reads that says, okay, they got together in groups of 50 and they sat down on grass that was green. All right, now somebody could come along and say, well, I think the grass was red. Well, that's his right, but the passage is clearly stating that the grass was green.
Hmm.
And so there's not a lot of room for interpretation there. We know what it's saying. So a more substantive example would be the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead.
Right.
So the Bible clearly teaches that. Now, a person can say, well, I think the Bible's wrong, and that's their right. That's perfectly fine that they have the right to say that. But the Bible teaches that
Right.
Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So the interpretation, there's not a lot of room for different interpretations there. One can say, I think it's wrong or I think it's right, but the message that's being communicated is clearly Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So I think to summarize all of this, we say that the Bible is very clear in its message. And certainly there are areas of the Bible, like they're poetry. Well, and so a psalm might say, the hand of the Lord came down. Well, we understand that a literal hand didn't come
Right,
down.
right.
But we interpret that based on the intended meaning, which is that God's strength and presence acted on behalf of his people, and something happened that saved them. So even in those cases, the meaning is pretty clear. Now, again, we talked last time about the fact that for a very small percentage of the Bible, there's a few places where we might have an option between one meaning and another meaning. And so similar to that, there might be a few places where a word is a little bit unclear. We're not exactly sure what the word means, or the way that the wording is, a word could have more than one possible meaning, and so the interpretation could be a little bit, it could be one way or the other. Now, when I say that, I don't say that any interpretation is possible. I say there might be two possible interpretations, which is very different. To say, well, any interpretation is possible means that something could mean really anything or nothing.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
almost means it's nonsense. So if there's a place in the Bible, let's say, where there's two interpretations possible, well, okay, so that is a fair statement. We have to maybe evaluate context. We look at maybe other places. We decide what it possibly means in that context. But even in those cases, there are no places where a fundamental doctrine of Christianity is overthrown based on one interpretation or versus another in one of those rare spots. So our faith is not necessarily at risk because of a place where there's a legitimate difference of interpretation. So again, 99% of the time, the Bible is plain in its meaning. And then those few places where there's a few interpretations, we can legitimately say it's one or the other, but those cases don't overthrow anything that's fundamental. So in terms of who Jesus is, who God is, how do we get forgiveness of sins, how do we live the Christian life, and those kinds of fundamental doctrines, that Jesus Christ died for our sins and rose from the dead on the third day. He's now ruling from heaven. Those kinds of fundamental teachings aren't affected by this idea of that all interpretations are equal, which is actually false. But even if we have an interpretation that is legitimately one or the other, that doesn't affect our faith. So that's I guess that's how I can summarize it. Interpretation is not a matter of anybody's opinion, any interpretation. Just like any other part of communication in our lives, there's a plain meaning intended. And similarly with the Bible, a plain meaning is intended. And for 99% of the Bible, we know what that meaning is.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming, Andy, and thank you for sharing with us about interpretation. And I appreciate you coming. So thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure.